Um, Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Yadvinder, for your time. It's really early right now, it's 7 a.m. in London. But before starting, I would like to make the acknowledgement of the country, where I acknowledge the traditional owners and the citizenship of the lands on the lands we reach today. And I pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants. And now, continuing with this, I would like to introduce all of you to Professor Yadvinder Malhi from the University of Oxford, and also he's the director also of the Liverpool Center for Nature Recovery. And his research focuses on the functioning of tropical ecosystems. His team at the Environmental Change Institute has ongoing programs of research in Asia, Africa, Andes, Amazon, and many other places. And he's also a trustee of the Natural History Museum of London. And he's the former president of the British Ecological Society and has been the president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. And also he chairs several programs about biodiversity and conservation, many far to be listed here. So we are thank you, or really thank we are really we really appreciate your time, especially right now it's 7 a.m. in London. And here today we are going to have a seminar about the talk about losing the parachutes and the trends in tropical ecology, authorship, and location over 60 years, as this will invite us to look the critically patterns about the trends, about the authorship and equity that is behind research. So I think it's really good timing for us at the CBCS and here at the university to learn more about how the patterns of authorship and equity behind research and how those patterns are changing. And also, Professor Yadvinder has a commitment, a huge commitment to ending parachute science and inequity. So it's not only his big experience on tropical ecology, but also in this type of commitments for more equity and open science. So thank you for that. And I don't know, I think that without further ado, I think that Professor Yadvinder, you can give us your talk and your seminar. So thank you to everyone that is here here on the room and online. And again, thanks to you, Professor Yadvinder.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon there, good morning, early morning here in the UK, and it's a pleasure to be invited. So thank you for inviting me to come and speak with you all. And this talk is I really want to acknowledge my co-author here. This is a postdoctoral researcher with my lab, Dr. Shruti Krishnamurthy Parvati, who is the technical AI genius part of this work. That she did a lot of the technical analysis that I'll describe some of the results and interpretation of. And so science likes to aspire to be something that's meritocratic, that is about objective truth, that rises above the politics and particular values of different societies and cultures. But in practice, science, like all human enterprises, is embedded in the power structures of the world, the economic structures of the world, and the deep inequity that exists across the world in terms of access to resources, access to opportunity. And there are many ways that this manifests itself, but most apparently it is in the greater amount of science that is done in the wealthy countries of the global north compared to tropical countries. And this has been discussed in many formats. One phrase that I'm sure most of you have heard of is this concept of what's sometimes called parachute science or helicopter science. And sometimes there are narrower definitions of these terms, but I tend to prefer to just see them as a similar broad overarching term, which is about where the abundance of resources in wealthy countries means that when research and science is conducted in less wealthy countries, scientists with their grants from wealthy countries come over, extract data, perhaps work with local researchers, but in a very exploitative manner, and go out and publish their papers in their home countries or internationally, get their career progress and etc., and don't really have long-term, fair and equitable collaborations with their partners in the host countries. And this can occur across many aspects of science. It can be the medical sciences, anthropology, the more engineering sciences, but also it is quite a strong feature of the practice of ecological science. And so we've seen in recent years quite a few articles bemoaning the existence of parachute science and striving to push back against it. But we've seen very little analysis of both the prevalence of such a scientific practice and also what the trends are over time. Is this a situation that's steady over time, deteriorating over time, or improving over time? And so what we sought to do is to try to add some metric and look at some of the geopolitics and economics of how the situation was changing over time. And this was triggered by a couple of roles I've had recently that strives to tackle this. And one, as was mentioned, is until just over a year ago, I was president of the British Ecological Society. And as part of my presidency, we really tried to push forward a roadmap for increasing global equity in ecological research. And this was partially built from my own research experience. As was mentioned, I've spent decades working in tropical forest countries, studying tropical forests and savannas. I'm sure that it's far from perfect, the research model that I've tried to adopt, but it has tried to be inclusive and long-term. So it's been based around building long-term collaborations with local partners in South America and Africa in particular, and conducting long-term scientific research, but also trying to provide opportunities for local collaborators, for students, to publish internationally, to develop their careers. So over my career, I've tried to embody ethical practices in international science. And so in my role as president of the British Ecological Society, I was very keen to push forward a broader roadmap for global equity. And this was here are some 5 of the elements that we pushed forward in this roadmap that is being further developed and over the coming years. And that was around leadership, around communication, around publishing practices, which are amongst the most challenging aspects. The deep inequitability and affordability of publishing, the high fees, something that the transition to open access has not helped and actually amplified in many ways, the high publication fees that make publication in many journals prohibitive, membership rates, and also in terms of developing future pathways for improving equity in global ecological science. And but then this particular analysis was also triggered by involvement with the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, which last year celebrated its 60th anniversary at its annual meeting in Rwanda. And the ATBC is the oldest international ecological society. It started from a very US-dominated base in the 1960s, where it was really US scientists working in Panama and Costa Rica that were the foundations of the society. But over the years, it's diversified in membership and governance, and aspires to be a global ecological society. And if you're interested in knowing, in being involved more, next year's annual meeting will be in Xishuangbanna in China. And so I hope many of you look into possibly participating in that meeting. And this focus on tropical ecology has been partially because that's been my focus, but also I think it's one of the fields of science that's at this frontier of questions around global equity and scientific practice, and that's because the focus of attention are the tropics, the predominantly less wealthy countries of the global south, and yet the resources to study these countries have traditionally been mainly in the wealthier countries of North America, of Europe, of Australia, and others. And so built into the field of tropical ecology is this inequity where the biological wealth is in the tropics and the financial wealth is outside of the tropics. And so tropical ecology has had to face these issues for a longer time, but also I think perhaps has made progress in addressing some of these issues more rapidly than other fields of science. So there are lessons that can spill over more widely from the imperfect way that tropical ecology is addressing some of these issues. So at the 60th anniversary last year, I was asked to do some sort of synthesis of what were the trends in where tropical ecology was done, the patterns of tropical ecology over the previous 60 years. And fortunately, I had a good coffee discussion with my colleague Shruti, and we decided rather than having a qualitative discussion, we would try something quantitative and see whether we could ask questions about the patterns of tropical ecological research over the last 60 years. So key questions were around, some of these were not all of these were around equity, but where is tropical ecology research being conducted, and which country are the researchers that do this research based in, and then the metric we chose to focus on is how much local country co-authorship is there in tropical ecology research, and then what are the trends in all of the above since 1960. And so this key metric is that how often do papers have local country co-authors? Now, I'll say it straight away, this is an imperfect metric. There are many ways that co-authorship can be tokenistic. You could add your local collaborator in as a co-author, but not really involve them intellectually in the creation and production of science, not provide opportunities for longer term development. You can still have parity science and have local co-authorship if it is token. But the advantage is that at least this is a metric that we can analyze in the publication data and look at trends over time. And so to do this, we employed large language models and ChatGPT in particular. And so our overall methodology was to take all the abstracts in the web of science and then develop a large language model prompt and come up with a detailed structural output. And the advantage of using large language models over traditional text searches is the ability to have context. And so the difficult metric to extract is where research is done, which country the research is done in. And if you to do this manually, you would have to read a paper, at least the abstract, and look at the location and then identify to country. And previous attempts to do this have typically done a few thousand papers and looked at trends. We wanted to look at the entire Web of Science database in tropical ecology, which is around 180,000 papers. And what large language models enable us to do is extract context. So if a paper says that this research was done in Juruá National Park, then the large language model would know, oh, that's a national park in Brazil, in the Amazon, and therefore ascribe a location and a biome to that work. And so this is the full ChatGPT prompt. So there's quite an art to writing a good prompt, and Shruti went through an online course to do this. I'm not going to talk you through this prompt, but you can see that beyond the little round short inquiries that many of us might do into ChatGPT, there is a way of having a much more structured approach that makes these prompts into very useful and powerful research tools. A few things I'll just mention. In this prompt, at the bottom, you can see we list the biomes that we're interested in. So we looked at forest, shrublands, grasslands, savannas, mangroves, wetlands, coastal, coral reef, and marine. And so we didn't necessarily capture all tropical biomes, but the vast majority were captured. We had a few little checks in there much of the Brazilian savanna literature talks about the cerrado, but doesn't mention savanna. So we used things like that to try and capture uh, those aspects, and we classified things into standard name and ISO names. So many studies were global, so we also then had to have those as a separate category, where somebody may be looking at tropical forests worldwide, rather to say through a satellite remote sensing study, rather than in a particular area. So there's always various things to catch, but overall, this was our overall chat prompt, which is took a lot of thought, but it's quite a short prompt overall for the power of the analysis that emerges. So I'll start off with quite a few caveats. We only looked at the Web of Science abstracts. I think a future more expansive analysis could try and take abstracts in multiple sources, including non-English language publications. So Web of Science is dominated by English language publications, and it's also dominated by papers rather than books. And so uh, uh, that has consequences. The relative dominance of English in abstracts and of papers has changed over decades. So, for example, in the 1970s, there's excellent tropical forest research in books in German, and so those would be missed in such an analysis. There's some excellent journals in Latin America that are Spanish language only. Some of them are captured by Web of Science, but many are not, and so they also would be missed. So it's a partial analysis, and we need to be aware of that. On the other hand, English is increasingly the global language of international science, so it does provide a useful tool to understand global trends in science. As I already mentioned, co-authorship in publication is only one metric of trends in global scientific equity. It's far from perfect. There are many other ways that we could look at this, but at least it is one that we can track over 60 years. There are challenges. Tropical co-authors may be hosted in Global North institutions. It could be a student from Brazil is here in Oxford, so they would have an Oxford affiliation in their research, but maybe they're only here for a few years. So I think in some ways they could be regarded as a Brazilian researcher working in Brazil, but they would not be captured in such a structure as a local researcher. We don't attempt any search by names and are putting names into nationalities and groups. That's quite problematic. Now, for example, I'm second generation Indian origin. So if you searched on my name, you may label me as an Indian author, even though I've spent my entire life in the UK. So trying to use names to describe national origins is very hazardous. So we avoid that. And also, parachute science isn't just an international phenomenon. It can happen within countries as well. That wealthy parts of countries, such as, for example, the south of Brazil, can have parachute science practices in the north, in the Amazon region of Brazil, and also science itself can parachute into local communities, not provide equitable relationships with indigenous peoples or with local communities. And so even if the geographical parachutes are avoided, the structures that can lead to other forms of parachute science that are beyond the scope of this analysis. And so moving on to results, there'll be quite a few figures from now on, so I'll try and talk you through a number of those figures gradually. But the broader context of this, if you look, is the surge in production of scientific literature, even accounting for the fact that there was more literature in books earlier on. There are which are not captured here. There is more and more scientific publications. So this is the overall number of publications as abstracts in Web of Science in tropical ecology. That drop off in the last few years is simply the lag in the database getting fully updated. The trend is still upwards and exponential. And so when we look at changes over time, this is in a context of rapid rise of publication. So I may start saying, oh, well, relatively publications in such a region have declined compared to other regions. that is still relative, and I should emphasize the word relative here, that most regions have seen an increase in publication, but the proportions at the rates at which different regions are increasing are different. So we must bear in mind that all of this analysis in the context of this surge of scientific activity globally in the last few decades. So before getting to questions of who's doing it, it's interesting to look at where is tropical ecology being conducted, and by that I mean what are the geographical locations where the research is conducted, independent of whether it's done by local researchers or by international researchers. And this shows the overall trend by decade, by continent, and this was striking to me. Uh, before I did this analysis, if somebody had asked me where was tropical ecology done pre-1980s, I would have thought, oh, well, actually, probably the Americas, US in terms of Puerto Rico and Hawaii, Central America, Panama, Costa Rica have been hugely influential in shaping our thinking in ecology over the last tropical ecology over the last 60 years. And the surprise that came out from this analysis was that going back before the 1980s, the largest amount of literature was in Africa, and then with North and Central America a close second. And what we've seen as trends over this time is the decline, a strong decline in the proportion of literature coming from Africa, a relative decline in North and Central America, and the rise of literature from South America, which is in orange here, and Asia in blue over this period, and also Oceania and Australia, which I'll get into a bit more, peaking a bit relatively in the 80s and 90s and relatively declining as these other regions have risen. So strong continental trends in where tropical ecology is being conducted, and particularly diversification away from North and Central American domination, but a surprising strong presence of Africa pre-1980s and a decline since then, which I'll explore a bit more later on. We also looked at these trends across different biomes, and so I'll just highlight the top 5 countries by biome in these areas. And it's interesting in this context to look at Australia, that was amongst the wealthier countries, was quite prominent in particularly forest work, but especially in marine mangrove and marine studies. And Australia dominated marine ecology and still is the major contributor to marine ecological research. But relatively has been declining as other reasons have picked up. So as the spread of research has moved away from more internationally, there have been trends there. Of course, none of this says who's doing the research or whether this is equitable. This is simply just looking at the geographical pattern of research. So if we look across all biomes by country, and here I show on the left, there's a lot of colors here, so I'll try and talk you through these slowly. The left shows trends in the countries that are the top 10 locations for research now, and the right shows countries that were the top 10 locations for research in the pre-1980s. So if you just focus on the top left figure here, you can see a few interesting trends. You see Australia in red being a very significant publisher or a location for tropical research, particularly in marine and coastal systems, and being still significant but declining relatively. And you see Brazil in blue rising in prominence. So that's a quarter of all tropical ecological research is now conducted in Brazil. You see not so many strong trends in other countries. Probably worth noting in brown here is the rise of China from being negligible pre-1980s to being in the top 2 or 3 most significant publishers of tropical ecological research, and the steady relative decline of the United States from being the leading source of publications pre-1980s to still being in the top few, but relatively declining. The right-hand side shows the countries that were the top 10 sources of publication pre-1980s and their relative decline. And the most striking thing here is this decline of African countries. You see in yellow, you see Nigeria as the most prominent source of tropical ecological research, much of which it was different in focus. It was often focused on management and production rather than on pure ecological questions, in savannas in particular, rather than in forests. But that has declined quite substantially over time. And you see similar patterns in other countries such as Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, and so a lot of these African countries that were quite prominent have declined. It's interesting to speculate, and I'll explore that a bit later, why African ecology hasn't shown the same trends, positive trends that other regions have. And this figure shows the same results as a map. If you look at where tropical ecological research was conducted pre-1980s, you see the US, Brazil, and Australia particularly sticking out as leading locations for research, and also Nigeria in West Africa really sticking out there. And post 2010s, you see the Brazil's rise to prominence in yellow there, the relative decline of other countries, but the rise of China and India, and the disappearance of Africa in the top metrics. It's from being significant, particularly in West Africa in the 1980s. There's been a relative decline in research done in Africa, or Africa's lagged behind in research is probably a better way to describe it. As this analysis was in Rwanda, I particularly focused on Africa to explore this in detail. So what you see is the decline in the relative prominence of West Africa in pre-1980s, but an increasing presence of other parts of Africa overall, but still relatively small compared to other regions. You see South Africa dominating and bits of East Africa also emerging. So better geographical spread, but at a lower rate compared to many other regions of the world. So one obvious question is, how does this research scale with the amount of biome area? And I'll focus on forests for this analysis first. So we see Brazil is dominating in forest research. Brazil also has the largest area of tropical forest on the planet. So perhaps to some extent we would expect that. To what extent do the amount of publications correspond to the area of that biome? And so what we did here is look at the proportion of publications from just from the top 15 countries in yellow, and from all other countries, which are the gray points here, and the proportion of tropical forest area. And you see broadly a positive correlation. The dashed line represents all data. The bluish line is just the top 15 countries. And so to some extent, the higher production from Brazil or location maps onto it, the larger tropical forest area here. But you see Brazil is still performing above its relative proportion of forest area. Other countries that perform relatively high given their tropical forest area include China, Mexico, Malaysia, and countries that are underrepresented despite their large area are countries like Myanmar, Papua New Guinea, Madagascar, and so some of these are countries with substantial infrastructure or political challenges that make them difficult places to conduct research in. So you can see even allowing for forest area, some countries are overperforming or performing well, and some are underperforming in this context. And this map below also shows the degree, the number of publications per area on tropical forest ecology per area of tropical forest. So the blues are countries that are generally performing quite well, and the reds are areas that the countries are underperforming given their context. So you see things like Democratic Republic of Congo, even India to some extent, Myanmar, and generally Southeast Asia, given the significance of its tropical forest areas, tends to perform less well than other regions. And we can also do a similar analysis for savannas and see different patterns there. The map below captures the key element here, that the most significant savanna countries are, are often in Africa, but there's very little research done in these countries for a variety of reasons, including poverty and geopolitics, stability overall. You see high performers such as South Africa coming through in parts of Eastern Africa, and Brazil with its Cerrado savanna biome doing particularly well. And you can see that also in this figure, with Brazil publishing a lot, Australia coming through as significant in this area, and lots of sub-Saharan African countries having much less research. Okay, so that's really, thus far, this has really been about the geography of tropical ecology, not so much about who is doing it and the issues around equity. So I want to now explore this metric of where are the researchers based and how much local research collaboration is there. So this figure shows who are where are the lead authors of publications based over time, and you see if you go back to the pre-1980s, most lead authors were based in the United States, and you can see Australia also comes up as quite significant over time. And on this macro scale, the largest trend has been this blue, this rise of Brazil as a source of lead authorship in tropical ecology, and the decline of, for example, Nigeria, where you see in yellow there in tropical ecology. And just this is a graph that Brazilians always enjoy seeing, the overtaking. If you look in year on year in terms of lead author publications, you see that Brazil overtook the United States around 2015, 2016 as the source, as a primary source of lead authorship in tropical ecology. My colleagues call this the ultrapasso, the overtaking. It's a source of joy amongst any Brazilian colleagues. So we're getting onto this this most important metric, the one that I focused on. What fraction of authors and co-authors are based in the country where the research is conducted? And for the overall period, we until 2000, Web of Science didn't give individual affiliations to each author, but it just grouped all the affiliations, so you could see if there were co-authors from that host country. You couldn't see what fraction of the co-authors were from that host country. So the first analysis we do here is simply looking at all the affiliations of the authors of a paper to see how was there local co-authorship? Were there any local co-authors in that paper? And if you look at the striking thing is, prior to the 2000s, the norm in tropical ecology was to have no local co-authors, something that strikes me as astonishing now, but that was the normal practice, that if you were a European scientist going to work in let's say Peru, you would do your research, you'd go and publish, you may acknowledge your local partners in the acknowledgements, but it would not be normal practice to include them as co-authors of the work as well. So this could be one definition, well, a partial definition of parachute science. And the situation actually deteriorated in the 1990s before substantially improving in the 2000s and the 2010s. So now about 80% of papers in tropical ecology tend to have local co-authorship. We shouldn't perhaps always expect that number to be 100%. There may be some analyses that are satellite-based analyses or global reviews that are over multiple countries that there may not be an obvious reason for co-authorship from a tropical country, but it probably can still improve over 80%. But it's interesting to speculate what happened in the 1990s. What changed? I think what was occurring then was that tropical ecology suddenly became an object of wider interest. The deforestation of the Amazon, in particular, got international attention, And so there was an increasing focus on research on tropical ecology questions, but the patterns of partnership and equity lagged behind. So there was a surge of publications on deforestation of the Amazon, for example, but those partnerships and relationships that took a time lagged behind by about a decade. A particularly influential process was led by Brazil. It's something that I was involved in my early postdoctoral career, a program called LBA, the Large Scale Biosphere Atmosphere Program in Amazonia, which in the 1990s and 2000s was a big effort to understand the ecology and the climate of the Amazon, led by Brazil with partnership with the US and with Europe, but it strongly insisted that any research conducted in Brazil had to involve long-term local capacity building, long-term partnership, that you couldn't come in for a 2-year project and just extract data and go away. And that changed the culture of research in Brazil, built a lot of capacity in Brazil, but also I think became a model for that spread out beyond Brazil across the tropics over time. But so I think that was at least one factor, both in this pattern we see here and in the rise of research in Brazil. We can look at this at country level as well and see what is going on by country. And the top line here in purple is so this study looks at what fraction of ecology papers have some element of local co-authorship. And the top line there is the US. So this could be taken as a model of what you might expect from a prosperous country conducting research in its own territory. So in the US, and if you're wondering what are the tropical locations in the US, it would be places like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, maybe to some extent Florida, as a foci of research. And so what you see there, that is around 80% is perhaps an aspirational level of papers having local co-authorship. You wouldn't expect this to be 100%. That 100% would perhaps indicate parochial science. If your paper's never involved in outside researchers researching in your country, or global analyses, etc., it would come across as somewhat parochial. The phenomenon I mentioned earlier of students being in other countries and researching their home countries, would also dilute that effect. So we'd aspire to, I'd say, around 80%, 90% as the expected local participation rate of a prosperous, well-resourced country. The good news is you see that many countries have reached that level in the post-2000 era. So you see China in brown there, you see India in pink, you see Australia there already quite high in red, Brazil in blue, and Mexico here in this darker green. And so all those countries have achieved similar rates. You can see common patterns. They all seem to be quite large, uh, uh, relatively large economy tropical nations, at least China, Brazil, India, and Mexico. There's a common feature there. You see Indonesia in gray beginning to rise rapidly into that context. Another aspect you see are countries that were very significant in the development of the science of tropical ecology. Panama and Costa Rica, Panama in green here, Costa Rica in light blue. And you see they had very low, in this seminal period in tropical ecology, there was very little local participation. It's improved over time, but it lags behind what we see in these larger countries. And that may be a legacy of still a slightly colonial approach to science there, but also maybe a capacity issue. These are relatively small countries. And then other patterns that you see are big African countries like Cote d'Ivoire, and which was significant, lagging behind, showing much less improvement in local participation. And so for the post-2000 period, we can go a little bit further. As a post-2000 Web of Science gives affiliations for individual authors. So we can thus think what fraction of the authors were locals. Pre-2000, if there was one author from the local country, that would come across as that this paper has local co-authorship. We couldn't go any further. Post 2000, we can actually say, well, a quarter of the authors are from the host country, 3/4 are from the host country, etc. And that gives an idea of more meaningful participation in the work. So if on the left, we're just looking at the top 10 countries, and I'll just focus on that, and you see that the high-performing countries, the Brazils, the Indias, etc., in this participation, typically 75% of the authors are from the host country where the research is conducted. Some countries like Mexico in black here are showing a steady improvement. And here we see Indonesia showing a strong improvement here in blue. So we are seeing in the top performers, we're seeing an improvement over time in participation. On the right, we've got the bottom performers. I won't go into detail, but we see a lot of African countries, the Democratic Republic of Congo at the bottom there. We see in this light green, we see Venezuela, which was a significant contributor to tropical ecology prior to 2000s, but with its geopolitical or internal political challenges, it's been declining as a source of tropical ecological science in this. There's some interesting stories to do with individual countries. This is a map form showing a similar result. The top left shows the participation at the pre-2000 and how many papers had local authorship. Post 2000 on the right, and then the bottom figure shows the relative change from the top left to the top right. So if I just zoom in on that bottom figure, you see that overall the pattern you see here is blue, which means there's positive changes going on. So all the countries that you see here in different shades of blue are where local co-authorship trends have been positive over the last 60 years. So some way to go, but we are seeing a different model of ecology than what we saw prior to the 2000s overall. The areas that are more white colored, neutral colored, or even orange are areas that we're seeing no change or a decline. So you see particularly Africa standing out there as an area of relatively less improvement, particularly in Central Africa and in the Sahelian regions of Africa. There has been a more gradual improvement in Southern and Eastern Africa. So there's some interesting geographical patterns there. So the final thing I want to look at is that we also see to what when a country is not participating in research, it may be due to the prevalence of extractive parachute science and other practices, but it may also be other factors, geopolitical. The countries simply struggle in having the capacity and the resources to provide scientific partnership in international research. And so one thing we looked at is a range of socioeconomic factors to see to what extent could the proportion of local partnership be explained by these factors. So we looked at Human Development Index, GDP per capita, so both measures of relative prosperity of a country, and found those to be quite weak predictors of this proportion, at least amongst these top performing countries that we looked at. Maybe because all of them had relatively high HDI compared to sub-Saharan African countries. What we did find to be significant predictors were simply the size of a country and its overall size of its economy as measured by GDP. So big, economically powerful countries tended to produce a more local partnership, tend to have the power and the resources and maybe the political will to ensure more equitable practices in publication compared to smaller countries. So we see China up here. We see some countries outperforming their GDP. So Brazil there and Australia are two countries that produce more tropical ecology science than you'd expect purely from GDP and population size alone. And you see another set of countries down here that relatively underperform. You see Japan, for example, is there as having less tropical ecological research for its size. So, overall, we are seeing these trends of greater publication, but maybe dominated by the large, relatively economically powerful countries in the global south, although they're using a wider tail of other countries where this pattern occurs. But a final metric we could look at is higher impact publications. So we are seeing a wider spread, but are the big papers in ecology uh, still dominated by the global north in terms of lead authorship? And there we do see that that is indeed the case. If you look at the average citations by publication and look at the affiliation of the lead author, you still see very much wealthy countries dominate the story. So the higher impact science still tends to be take advantage of the wealth and the resources that occur in the wealthier countries to deliver in the capacity to deliver. So to conclude, prior to 2000, local author inclusion was very poor. There's been a big positive shift in local co-authorship since 2000, and many large countries, Brazil, Mexico, India, and China, now have local participation rates similar to the global north. In some ways, it could be debatable to what extent countries like China should be considered part of the global south anymore. And so, have they effectively shed parachute science? It's a question. Strong positive trends are found across Latin America and tropical Asia, but Africa is certainly lagging behind, and high impact publications are still dominated by the global north. So I'll conclude there, and that gives us around 10 minutes, hopefully, to have some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Malhi, for this insightful presentation. I don't know if we still have time for questions or yeah. If there's someone on Zoom or here that want to make a question, if not, I think that.
I've invited the people online for us to put their questions in the chat or raise their hand
Okay.
to unmute.
Oh yeah, there's a question.
Sharad, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hello, Dr. Yadvinder. Thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. Really good talk. I just have a couple of questions. One thing, like with the ChatGPT or like large language model prompt, have you done any validation or like in like ground truthing, what we call in spatial ecology, like looking randomly at some papers and looking the information that the model has provided, is that correct to your satisfaction? Like that kind of validation has been done for your analysis?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, we did. We looked at about, I think it was about 1,000 papers directly manually to see how accurate it was, and the accuracy was above 90%. I can't remember what the exact number is. I think it was maybe around 95% overall. So yeah, we did a validation, and compared to a classic text search approach, which is more like 70% accuracy, we found the large language model was a big improvement in accuracy in extracting location.
Okay, and I had just one more question. So, like when we're looking at the parachute this thing, or like the overall publication of authors, or like from the geographical this thing, so how much of the policies, like for example, with India, there is a like strict, like larger strict policies of like limiting foreign researchers in India for like the research, and this has particularly impacted like mostly marine tropical collaborations or like collaborations with bigger author for like meta studies. So how much of these restrictions, though they might improve like as we are seeing the quality of local authors and publication, but like what kind of impact, if you have seen anything like in like the better, like as you said, like the overall higher citations is still less like for a place like India, but like the authorship has increased. So how that pans
No,
off?
I think that's a very astute observation. I think there are elements of that. All of these larger countries have stronger regulations around research. And I think it's a balance between having regulations that ensure local partnership and cooperation, which I think Brazil, in my experience, has had a long time of. I mean, it made it sometimes difficult to do, in my own experience, do research in Brazil, but ensured strong local capacity building. And places like India, where I think, if I was frank, I'd say the restrictions are actually damaging tropical ecology in India and damaging Indian researchers, because it's so difficult for international researchers to get permits to collaborate with Indian researchers in my own experience. So I think that there's a spectrum there. Certainly in the case of India, you may end up having stronger local authorship, but India's tropical ecology overall is weakened because it isn't part of these international collaboration networks. Whereas in somewhere like Brazil, has some protective policies there, but is still very open to international collaboration. And you see that explains to me why a country like Brazil has surged in this area, and a country like India, while having strong local partnership, is underperforming in terms of its tropical ecological international footprint.
Thank you, Yadvinder. I have a question for you from the chat from Eddie Duan, who is asking, how are expected publication numbers calculated from country GDP?
But they're not calculated from GDP. We just looked at the metric that I showed before, the proportion of local publication, and we plotted that against GDP to see what the trends were in that relationship. And then you could put a straight line through that trend and see countries that were overperforming compared to that trend and underperforming compared to that trend. So we just looked at the observed relationship in the data and then plotted a line through the average there to look at that.
Okay, thanks, Yadvinder. Matt Holden, would you like to unmute and go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful talk. I was wondering if, in terms of figuring out ways to actually thwart or prevent parachute science, one potential method is, as reviewers of grants, we'd sort of tank grants that look like they're going to be doing parachute science. And so how do we go about doing that when some of the funding bodies don't necessarily have selection criteria that are specifically aligned with eliminating parachute science?
This is something that is part of our British Ecological Society roadmap. So we are in discussion with the UK funding sources, like the National Environmental Research Council, to have these international equity principles alongside other metrics of equity in the work. Many funding bodies already do ask for some sort of reporting to what extent there's gender equality in your plans, or have you at least considered those factors? It may not be something that tanks a grant, but it's something it flags up in the application. Have you thought about these? So in a similar way, we are encouraging UK funding sources, but I think this could spread more widely to consider global equity in what's being proposed. So a reviewer would at least highlight, oh, this research, this guy's going into this country for 6 months collecting data, and there's no local partner. What's going on here? So I think that's an area that it's easy to make progress, and I think many funders would be open to have that, at least as a, if not as a ultimate criterion, at least as something that reviewers should consider and comment on when they look at a proposal.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yadvinder. I have a question from the chat from Conrad Pratt, who's asking whether you've looked at trends in lead authorship versus secondary authorship.
Not specifically in terms of the relative affiliation. I'm trying to think whether any of our analyses capture that. I think the answer is we haven't overall. We've seen a relative rise in the proportion of lead authorship that comes from the tropical countries overall, but I haven't got the numbers at hand.
Yeah, I just was thinking that you mentioned like sort of tokenism, and one way to sort of get at that question is looking at, yeah, if they're a lead author, or if they're a secondary authorship. I was just curious, but I understand you can only also do so much.
Right. Yeah. That should be. I think we have the numbers, at least in terms of lead author versus overall proportion there, and we do see an increase in lead authorship from the tropical south. But I think the relative thing there is to the relative change in that compared to overall participation. That would be a useful thing to pull out. Maybe I'll try and pull out those numbers and see what we find. Thank you.
Thanks, Gold. I think that I will finish with the last question. In your opinion, Professor, what do you think would be like the next steps for ensuring these positive trends to end parachute science? Like, what would be the practical things that we should be doing?
I think part of it is to understand geography, that there's no single solution everywhere. I think part of the things that we discussed are around embedding the mindset of equity in the development of proposals and then in publications. And I think those trends are positive, but we need to encourage those trends in terms of a wealthy country perspective. But I think some of the challenges go beyond them. They're about developing the culture of long-term cultivation of relationship rather than short-term projects. In places like sub-Saharan Africa, it's about developing capacity, supporting capacity in the longer term through partnerships rather than any particular project, and often actually and that can be getting local students to do PhDs internationally, but then go back to their home countries afterwards, and many issues like that. But often it's built into a very challenging economic situation and other contexts as well. So I think there's a longer term challenge, particularly in Africa, that needs to be faced. But I think that these macro level things in terms of mindset change, I think we've seen a huge mindset change. We often deplore the situation as it is now, but one of the most insightful things that came out of this analysis was things have improved a lot in the last 25 years. A long way to go for sure, but there has been a big improvement in mindsets since the mindset of the late 20th century.
Yeah, thank you.
There is one last question, if we can just squeeze it in quickly before we wrap up, from Matthew Holden again. Yadvinder, did you distinguish from publications using open access data from a country that was already published versus data that was collected as part of the study? And Matt's wondering if there's differences in the trends there.
That would be very hard to pull out, I think, at this scale. Considering we analysed abstracts in Web of Science, so that none of that information would be there. You'd have to dive into probably the acknowledgements and other aspects there to work out data sources, etc. It's a very interesting question, but I think that would be a much more substantial bit of work to try and extract and validate that sort of information.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Professor Malhi, for your insightful presentation. And I think that this helps us to not only understand the trends that we have in tropical ecology now, but also I think that is helping us to understand how we should be doing global research. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And NIRE is also organizing a workshop tomorrow to discuss this program. So we will definitely give you some feedback from the workshop.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.